They thought they could steamroll over me, literally, until I learned something that changed everything. Name's Wade. I'm 53 years old, give or take a few hard winters, and I've lived on this patch of Texas land since before I could walk. This ranch has been in my family for 4 generations. My daddy taught me how to fix a fence before he taught me to read, and I'll be damned if I ever let anyone tell me what I can and can't do on my own soil. For years, life moved. With the sun, up at dawn, working the fields, feeding the stock, checking on the spring that watered everything we had. It wasn't flashy, but it was mine. Honest. Clean. That changed the morning I saw the orange flags. Men in reflective vests and hard hats were stomping through my pasture, like they owned it, sticking stakes into the ground, drawing lines I didn't recognize. A white SUV rolled up with a clipboard woman inside. She smiled like I was some old man she had to humor. "We're from the HOA," she said. "Just prepping for the pipeline installation. No request, no warning, just announcement." The next week they brought in the machines, bulldozers, diggers, the whole circus. They tore up my fence, spooked my horses, paved straight across the south field where my father's ashes are scattered beneath the cottonwoods. I tried to stop it, called the sheriff, the county office. Hell, I even tried reasoning with their smug little HOA president. They all shrugged. "Nothing you can do," they said. "It's already approved." But while they were busy laying pipe, I was digging into something else. They told me I didn't have a choice. They were dead wrong. The letter came folded in a stiff white envelope, delivered not by the postman, but taped to my fence post like a threat. It had the HOA's gold-embossed logo in the top corner and smelled like printer ink and perfume. It didn't say "Dear Wade" or even "Hello." It just dove right in, like a courtroom punch to the gut. Notice of utility installation, pursuant to Easement Clause 714, and in accordance with the Eminent Domain Adjacent Use Act. It went on for 2 pages, full of bold phrases and capitalized jargon, the kind of language built to make a man feel small. But what I gathered was this. Some shiny new HOA development, 2 miles over the ridge, wanted to build a water pipeline straight through my south field, and they weren't asking, they were telling. A clause I'd never seen, buried in some ancient plat map, supposedly gave them limited access for communal benefit. The adjacent domain trick. Old trick, slick with legal grease. I'd heard of it used in cities, not out here. I folded the letter slow and flat, then stuffed it in my shirt pocket. Next morning, I saddled up and rode down to their next HOA meeting. You ever walk into a room and feel every eye clock your boots, before they even meet your face? That was me at the clubhouse. Fluorescent lights, lemon-scented floor polish, and rows of bored, bejeweled neighbors nibbling on catered crackers. I stood out like a steer in a china shop. Then came Brad. Brad was the kind of man who wore cologne to Zoom meetings and power-laughed at his own bad jokes. HOA president, self-appointed savior of suburbia, with a $3,000 blazer and a clipboard he didn't read from. "Ah, the rancher," he said, drawing out the word like it tasted foreign. "Glad you could join us." I told him there must have been a mistake, that no one had asked permission, that the field was in use, that it was mine. He smiled like I'd just recited a child's poem. "The land's yours, sure," he said, sipping from a smart-looking water bottle. "But access is in the public good. We're simply utilizing our rights. You'll be compensated, eventually." The board chuckled. One woman whispered something and stifled a laugh. Another offered me a granola bar. I left before I did something I'd regret. The next week, the bulldozers arrived. They didn't even hesitate. Rolled in at dawn like a war convoy, ripped through my gate, trampled the tall grass, laid out pipeline markers in my clover patch like they were decorating for a parade. My gelding bucked clear through a split fence from the racket, and I lost 2 calves the next morning, spooked into a ravine by the noise and motion. When I called the sheriff, he told me civil matters were out of his hands. The county office said the permits had been fast-tracked. When I demanded to see the signatures, they sent me to voicemail. The pasture wasn't just land, it was history. My father used to walk that field every morning, cup of black coffee in hand, boots Dude up from the grass. He died 3 winters ago, and I spread half his ashes under the cottonwood tree by the well. Now that well was slick with backwash, discolored, reeking of diesel and machine grease. I remember kneeling beside it, the water thick and still, and whispering, "Sorry, Dad." That night I sat on my porch, watching the blinking lights of the construction zone pulse like an open wound in the dark. My fists clenched and unclenched. I wasn't a man quick to anger, but this wasn't just about a pipe. It was about being stepped on, about being told you don't matter. I might have stayed angry forever, powerless, bitter, if it weren't for Larry. Larry's a retired water rights consultant who'd helped settle a border dispute between 2 ranches north of here back in the 90s. Now he spent his days sipping sun tea and fixing tractors that didn't need fixing. He came by with a 6-pack and a raised eyebrow. "Heard you got city folks crawling up your draw," he said. I nodded. "They laid pipe right over the field, claimed they got the right. I'm fighting it, but..." He whistled low. "Water pipeline, huh? From the spring?" "Yeah," I said. "Tapped it straight from the slope. Cuts across into their fancy development." He leaned back in his chair, that consultant brain of his ticking. "Tell me something. You ever transfer water rights?" "No," I said. "Why would I?" Larry gave me a look that started as amusement, but sharpened into something else, like he'd just spotted gold dust in a mud pan. "Well," he said slowly, "they may have the pipe." He paused to sip his drink. "But do they own the water?" I stared at him. "What are you getting at?" "Wade," he said, setting his bottle down with a click. "You might be mad about the dirt, but if they never secured the water rights, then all they've done is lay an expensive straw in a dry cup." I didn't say anything for a long minute, then I smiled for the first time in weeks. The day Larry mentioned water rights was the day my whole perspective shifted. I'd been so focused on what they'd taken, my land, my peace, my father's favorite well. I hadn't stopped to consider what they hadn't taken. But when Larry dropped that little nugget, "They may have the pipe, but do they own the water?" it stuck in my brain like a burr on a wool sock. That night, I poured myself a cup of strong coffee, pulled up my old metal filing cabinet, and started digging. Buried under years of property taxes, veterinary bills, and feed receipts, I found a rolled-up topo map of the ranch, faded but legible. There it was, the spring, labeled Clear Ridge Source, trickling out of the limestone bluff just past the southern fence line. That water had run through this land since before the county had a name. I spent days cross-referencing old paperwork with county land records and hydrology maps. Visited the local registrar's office with a clipboard and a mission. And sure enough, I struck gold. Not literal gold, but the legal kind. The HOA had easement rights. That much was true. They'd gotten county approval to install a utility line, probably bullied some low-level clerk into fast-tracking it. But those rights only gave them the ability to build on my land. They never filed a water rights claim for the spring they were tapping into, and that was the loophole. See, in this state, water doesn't automatically come with the land. You have to apply for it, prove beneficial use, and then maintain the claim. My dad used that spring for our livestock and crops since the 70s. I'd been pulling from it for irrigation and backup drinking water for decades, and nobody had ever challenged that. They assumed no one would notice. They assumed wrong. Next stop was the County Water Board office, a squat beige building with a flickering fluorescent light and a single sleepy receptionist. I brought documentation, lots of it. Historical grazing maps, satellite images showing water usage over the years. A photo of me and my dad next to the old irrigation line dated 1988, with the spring burbling in the background. I filed a formal claim under beneficial agricultural use. Gave them a folder thick enough to kill a squirrel. They gave me a receipt and said it could take up to 45 days. But word travels fast in small towns, especially when there's a big HOA in the mix. The board bumped up my hearing, probably figuring, it'd be better to sort this before it turned into a lawsuit. The courthouse was packed on hearing day. I sat at the front, hands folded in my lap, wearing my best button-down and my father's old bolo tie. Larry sat next to me with a briefcase full of statutes and a worn-out smile. On the other side of the room was Brad, Mr. HOA president himself, flanked by two lawyers who looked like they'd rather be doing anything else. The board opened with, "My case." I stood, introduced myself, and explained the spring's location, its historical use, and the sudden, mysterious drawdown that started right when that pipe showed up. I submitted affidavits from two neighboring ranchers who remembered seeing my dad draw from the spring way back when. Even dug up an old invoice from a water testing lab dated 1991. Brad's team argued the HOA had invested significant resources into the infrastructure and deserved equitable use. The board chair, a man named Tilson, with gray eyebrows that looked like tumbleweeds, leaned forward and asked one question. "Did your HOA ever file for water rights?" Brad stammered. One of his lawyers reached for a folder, then whispered something. "No, sir," Brad finally said. Tilson nodded. Then, "I see no issue here, the water's his." Just like that, the vote was unanimous. I walked out of that courthouse with a grin so wide it damn near cracked my sunburn. Now came the fun part. I ordered a valve lock system, not the kind you buy at Home Depot. This was industrial grade, weatherproof, with a hidden panel. I spent a weekend digging a pit near the spring's source, carving out a spot beneath a natural outcrop that concealed the plumbing. Took care to do it quiet, too. No diesel engines. Just a shovel, a pry bar, and sweat. The same way my father taught me. Once it was installed, I tested the lock. Flawless. With a single crank, I could stop the entire flow before it ever reached the HOA pipeline. But I didn't. Shut it right away. No, I waited. Let them get comfortable. Watched their sprinklers whir and spit all across their pristine yards. Watched landscapers wash down sidewalks while their fountains gurgled uselessly in the hot sun. Then one morning, just before dawn, I drove my pickup out to the ridge, flashlight in hand, and knelt by the hatch. It was quiet, peaceful. A rabbit darted through the brush nearby. I unscrewed the cap, reached in and turned the valve. 1, 2, 3 clicks. Then silence. The sound of a spring dying, not forever, just long enough to make a point. The next morning I sipped my coffee on the porch, watching the horizon glow pink. And then I heard, distant at first, shouting, barking, that shrill panic of people who'd lost control of something they never truly owned. From my perch I could see them, HOA landscapers in neon vests, kicking at dead sprinkler heads. A couple standing beside a gurgling, half-dead fountain in their shared garden, arguing loudly. A woman in yoga pants stood in the cul-de-sac, flapping her arms like a bird that lost its nest. Brad himself came stomping down the path in a polo, shirt and boat shoes, barking into a cell phone, red in the face. I leaned back in my chair, took another sip, and smiled. I hadn't just won a legal battle. I'd hit them where it hurt. They thought power was about money, connections, bulldozers, and court threats, but out here power is the water, and now I owned every drop. They say a drought makes people desperate. I figured it'd take a few days, maybe a week before the HOA noticed, but they felt it the very next morning. Lawns started yellowing by noon. By sunset, their fountains went dry, those fancy little stone things they loved to light up at night. By day 3, the clubhouse pool was emptying fast, its bright blue tiles cracking under the heat like an old ceramic bowl. Then the residents started showing up. At first it was quiet, confused murmurs about low pressure, sprinklers clicking, uselessly into dust. By day 4, the neighborhood looked like a scorched movie set. Gardeners quit. Residents knocked on Brad's door like it was a fire sale. He kept telling them it was a glitch. Just a technical issue, he shouted at a crowd of retirees waving HOA bylaws. We're handling it. They weren't. The HOA brought in a plumber, one of those guys with a branded van and a clipboard, looking real important until he popped the utility box and scratched his head. They called the city water department, the county. Each time they ran into the same answer. That line isn't, city managed. It's privately sourced. The moment someone traced the pipeline back to my ridge, it was like someone dropped a stick of dynamite into the middle of their little wine and cheese castle. 3 days later, a woman in a navy blazer and expensive sunglasses pulled up to my ranch gate in a black Mercedes. She introduced herself as HOA counsel, though she looked more like a real estate agent than a lawyer. "We'd like to make this right," she said, sliding an envelope through the gate. I opened it slowly. It was a check, $40,000. The memo line read, "Water Easement Settlement." I smiled, tore the check clean in two and handed it back. "You can tell Brad I'm not for sale." Didn't take long for Brad to come himself. He drove up in his waxed SUV, stepping out like he owned the ground beneath his feet. Polo shirt, mirrored sunglasses, the whole smug package. He walked straight up to my porch, skipping the hello. "You've made your point. Now turn it back on." I didn't move. "That's not how this works. You're holding a community hostage, you know that, right?" "Nope," I said. "You held me hostage when you built that pipeline without asking. I'm just restoring balance." He jabbed a finger at me. "This is extortion." I didn't flinch. I reached into my back pocket and handed him a copy of the water deed. He stared at it, jaw tightening. "This is justice," I said. Word spread fast after that. Someone at the courthouse leaked the records. Someone else filmed Brad throwing a tantrum near a dead sprinkler head, kicking it like a toddler who dropped his lollipop. The video went viral. Title: HOA President Melts Down After Rancher Turns Off Water. I'd never used Twitter much, but my niece showed me the clip on her phone. It had over 2 million views. Someone had added banjo music in the background, but it wasn't just social media that took notice. A reporter from the local affiliate came out for an interview. I walked him through the entire ordeal, how they built without permission, how they tried to intimidate me, how they never owned the water. The next evening, the story aired at 6 and 10. Rancher fights back. Illegal pipeline leaves HOA high and dry. That same week, the State Environmental Board opened an investigation. Turns out the HOA had violated multiple regulations, diverting natural water without permits, building infrastructure over unzoned ag land, and failing to file impact reports, all swept under the rug, until now. The fines came fast and hard. 6 figures worth. The HOA tried to sue me, of course, but with the water deed and environmental violations stacked against them, their lawyers backed off quick. At the next HOA meeting, public tents packed with sunburned and furious residents, Brad was cornered. One woman shouted that her roses were dead. Another man said his koi pond boiled in the heat. The clubhouse gym smelled like mildew without running showers. The tipping point was when a grandmother stood up and calmly said, "You lied to us. You treated that man like dirt, and you brought shame to all of us." That was the end for Brad. He stepped down that night. No apology, no grace, just stormed out under a chorus of boos, chased by camera flashes. Back at my ranch, things were quiet again. I turned the valve back on, a little. Enough to keep the spring flowing naturally, to water my pastures, to honor the land like my father always did. The HOA applied for a new water source from the county, something official, something legal. Last I heard, it'd take 8 months. They'd have to truck in water in the meantime, at a cost of $2,000 a week. Me? I kept my spring, I kept my pride. And for the first time in a long while, I slept without the weight of injustice grinding at my chest. They came here thinking they could steamroll me. But out here, water runs deep, and so does payback. They came back with another offer a few weeks later. A thick, glossy packet delivered by courier. This time it wasn't Brad. It was some newly hired director of community infrastructure, trying to look official. Inside, a buyout proposal. They wanted to purchase the water rights outright, $100,000. I didn't even bother reading past the first page. Money wasn't the point, not anymore. I folded the packet, walked out to the fire pit, and fed it to the flames. Instead, I made a call of my own. There's a conservation trust out here, nonprofit folks who protect open lands and waterways. They're the quiet kind, the kind who believe that land isn't just real estate, it's legacy. After a few weeks of paperwork, we struck a deal. I sold long-term access rights to the spring and surrounding acreage to the trust, not for development, not for exploitation, but for preservation. They'll make sure the spring keeps flowing for generations and that no one, HOA or otherwise, can touch it without going through a gauntlet of legal checks. I didn't just protect my land, I sealed it in time. With the legal battles behind me and the pipeline valve under my lock, I turned my attention back to what mattered. I started rebuilding, fixed the fencing where they'd plowed through with bulldozers, laid new timber where the rails had cracked, cleaned out the contaminated well with help from a local solar company, and installed a solar-powered pumping system. Efficient, clean, self-sustaining. The grass came back slowly, cautiously, but it came back. That part of the pasture, the one they tore through, started to green up again after a few spring rains. Birds returned, coyotes howled at dusk again. It wasn't just land healing, it was me too. One morning I heard a knock on the gate. It wasn't Brad. He was long gone, probably yelling at some waiter in a city 2 counties over. No, this was Melissa, the new HOA president. Middle-aged, plain-spoken, wearing hiking boots instead of heels. She introduced herself, then waited. "I know what they did," she said, not looking for excuses. "And we're not here to pull that again." She took a deep breath. "We'd like to negotiate water access, legally, respectfully, with proper compensation and boundaries, if you're open to it." I nodded slowly. "I'm open," I said. "But on my terms this time." We drew up a proper contract, independent counsel, water usage caps, annual audits, maintenance responsibilities, and a fair monthly fee. Nothing that could be twisted or weaponized. Nothing unsigned. They'd get their trickle, enough for essential use, not to flood. Ornamental fountains or overwater petunias, and I'd get peace. These days, I don't worry when I see trucks on the road. I ride out most mornings before the sun hits full strength. Sometimes I stop by the spring, still clear, still bubbling, still mine. I tip my hat to the wind and listen to the birds chatter from the cottonwoods. The HOA lawns are modest now. Native plants, drought-resistant grasses, no more shallow fountains or vanity ponds. They've adapted, like they should have from the start. Out here we don't steal what isn't ours. We respect the land. And we remember who really holds the valve. Final image. Me on horseback easing through the pasture as the spring glints in the sun. The air smells like fresh sage and river water. The land is alive again, and justice still flows. They thought they were entitled to what they didn't earn. Thought they could pave over history, lay pipe through heritage, and drown out my voice with legal threats and polished shoes. But out here, we don't just inherit land, we become part of it. Every fence post, every hoofbeat, every drop of water tells a story. My family fought droughts, storms, and hard years to keep this ranch breathing, and I wasn't about to let some HOA with manicured lawns and inflated egos wash that away. I didn't shut off their water out of spite. I did it to remind them, and maybe myself, that respect isn't given just because you have money or a title. It's earned, one honest step at a time. The land doesn't forget who tends to it. And water? Water runs where it's valued, not exploited. Now the spring flows free, protected. My pasture's coming back, and the HOA? They learned what happens when you cross a man who knows the worth of his soil and his silence. I'm not a lawyer, not a politician, just a rancher who, stood his ground. Because out here, water runs where it's respected, and so do I.